Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The job came through a referral, which is how most of my work comes. One contractor recommending another for a job outside their specialty or their bandwidth. My contact in Delham said the church had water damage in its historic basement, foundation seepage from a winter that had been hard on old stone, and that they needed someone who could assess the structural situation and handle remediation without doing more damage to a building that was on the county historic register. I do this kind of work regularly, old buildings with old problems and clients who want the problems fixed without the building losing whatever makes it worth preserving. The pay was good and the timeline was a week, and I drove to Delham on a Monday morning in March with my equipment and my standard expectations. Delham is a small town, the kind that has contracted slowly over decades without quite tipping into the category of dying. Enough commerce and enough people to sustain its own identity without being able to sustain much growth. The church sat on the main street in the way that old churches sit on main streets in small towns, as though it had been placed there first, and the town had organized itself around it afterwards, which in Delham's case appeared to be literally true, based on what I could find about the town's founding. The building was mid-19th century stone, well maintained on the exterior, the kind of institutional care that comes from a congregation that takes its physical space seriously. The pastor met me at the side entrance on Monday morning. Her name was Vale Corton, and she was somewhere in her late 60s, compact and precise, with the specific quality of someone who has been in charge of something for long enough that authority has become posture rather than performance. She was pleasant and thorough, walking me through the church's history and the basement's known issues with the fluency of someone who had given this briefing before, and she was slightly too helpful in a way that I filed as the over-eagerness of a client who wanted to make a good impression and didn't examine more carefully than that. The basement was accessed through a door of the sacristy, stone stairs descending into a space that was clearly the original foundation of the building, low-ceilinged and thick-walled, with the specific quality of 19th century ecclesiastical construction, built to last several human lifetimes and proceeding to do exactly that. The water damage was real and visible, seepage through the east wall, leaving the expected mineral staining and some compromised mortar in the lower courses. A straightforward remediation job, once I'd assessed the full extent of it. I spent the first 2 days doing assessment, mapping the damage, testing the stone, establishing what needed to be addressed and in what order. The basement was divided into sections by later additions, a storage area that clearly dated from different periods of the church's history, utility infrastructure that had been retrofitted into the original space over decades. I worked through it methodically, section by section, and on Wednesday afternoon, I reached the oldest part of the basement. It was behind a section of wall that the water damage had affected more severely than the surrounding areas, the mortar in a roughly 6-foot section having deteriorated to the point where several stones had shifted, creating gaps that had accelerated the seepage problem. Behind the deteriorated section, revealed by the shifted stones, was a wall that was clearly not original construction, a later addition, carefully built, but built after the fact, filling what had previously been an opening. I could tell by the way the original stone framed it, the original foundation continuing on either side in a configuration that made no structural sense unless the section between had once been open. I noted it in my assessment as a filled opening, possibly a doorway to an exterior entrance that had been closed at some point in the church's history, and marked it for investigation once the water damage remediation was underway. Thursday morning, I removed enough of the later fill to expose what it had been covering. A door, stone-framed, set into the original foundation with the precise fit of something built at the same time as the surrounding wall, rather than inserted into it afterward. The door itself was wood, heavy, banded with iron, and the iron and the wood were in a condition that did not match their apparent age in a way that I registered and didn't yet have a framework for. Old materials in old buildings show their age in specific ways, and these showed none of them. The door was in the condition of something that had been maintained carefully and consistently. The wood treated, the iron clean of the deep rust that iron develops over a century and a half of basement humidity. Someone had been maintaining this door while concealing it behind a false wall. The lock was a mechanism I hadn't seen before, not padlock, not standard mortise, something integrated into the iron banding that required a specific engagement to release that took me about 15 minutes to work out. I want to be clear that I was aware, in a general way, that opening a concealed door in a client's building without permission was not standard professional practice. I want to be clear that I did it anyway, because the combination of the maintenance and the concealment and the specific quality of the door's preservation had produced in me a curiosity that I wasn't able to manage with professionalism alone. The door opened inward. What was on the other side was not the exterior foundation or a storage space or any architectural feature that connected to the building around it. What was on the other side was a place, a space with volume and light and air that were different in quality from everything on my side of the threshold in ways I'm going to try to describe accurately, while acknowledging that accurate description of something with no reference points in ordinary experience is a project with hard limits. The light was wrong first. Not the absence of light or excessive light, just light that came from no identifiable source and had a quality of distribution that didn't match any natural or artificial illumination I could describe. Even, too even. The kind of even that produces no shadows, which is not a quality light has in any normal environment. The air was different in a way I felt before I could analyze it. A pressure differential, slight but perceptible, as though the space beyond the door was at a marginally different atmospheric state than the basement, and underneath that a smell. Not bad exactly, just entirely foreign. Something that had no reference in my prior experience and that my brain kept trying to match against things it knew and kept failing. The space extended further than the door's location in the basement should have allowed, which is the detail that completed the picture in a way the light and the air hadn't quite managed on their own. I was standing in a basement in a building I had spent 3 days mapping, and I knew the dimensions of that building precisely, and what was on the other side of the door did not fit inside those dimensions. It extended into something that was not the church's footprint. It extended into somewhere else. I stood in the doorway for what I estimated as 2 minutes. I did not step through. I'm not certain I could have explained in the moment why I didn't step through, only that the threshold felt significant in a way that made crossing it a decision rather than a continuation of the action that had already opened the door. I closed it, engaged the lock, and went upstairs to find Vale Cortin. She was in the church office, which is where she was most mornings, and she looked up from her desk when I came in, and her expression was not the expression of someone about to be confronted with something unexpected. She looked like a person receiving a visitor she'd been expecting at some point and was now noting the arrival of. I told her what I had found. Not in great detail, just the facts, the concealed door. What was on the other side of it? My understanding that this was not standard building infrastructure. She closed the document she'd been working on and folded her hands on the desk and told me to sit down. What she told me took about 40 minutes. I'm going to recount it more briefly than that because some of it I'm still processing and some of it loses coherence when I try to summarize it, and some of it I'm not certain I have the right to pass on in full. The door had been there before the church. The founding congregation had discovered it when they broke ground in 1857, found it standing in the earth before the basement existed, freestanding stone frame, an iron-banded door in open ground, and the decision they'd made about it, which had been a decision made with the seriousness of people who understood they were setting a precedent that would outlast them, was to build around it. The church had been positioned and oriented to incorporate the door into its foundation, the basement designed to house it. The false wall added a generation later when the congregation decided that concealment was wiser than visibility for a feature of the building they weren't prepared to explain to anyone outside the community. The arrangement with what was on the other side had developed over decades, not immediately, not through any single decision, but through the accumulated relationship of a congregation and a door and whatever was accessible through it. Weil described the exchange in terms that were practical and measured, specific things sent through, specific things that came back, a relationship she characterized as mutual in a way that I found difficult to accept as a description of something that could be mutual, that anyone could enter into mutually with something they couldn't fully understand or communicate with in any conventional sense. I asked what came back through it. She said the term the congregation used was adjustment, which was not an answer in any ordinary sense, but which she elaborated on in terms that explained, retroactively, several things I'd noticed about Delham in 3 days of working there: a quality of the people, their specific affect, a cohesion and ease that I'd attributed to the tight-knit character of small towns, and that I now understood as something with a more specific origin. Generations of a congregation in relationship with something that came back through a door in their basement and integrated into their community in ways that were net positive by their accounting and that were downstream of a century and a half of an arrangement that nobody outside the town had been told about. I asked what happened when someone outside the arrangement found out. She told me there was a well-practiced response to that situation. She said it without threat, without any quality of menace, in the same practical tone she'd used for everything else. And the absence of menace was the most frightening part because it implied a confidence that didn't require menace as a supplement. I told her I was going to leave. I said it clearly, and I stood up from the chair. She said she understood and that I should take my time gathering my things. I went back to the basement and packed my equipment, and I carried it up the stairs and through the sacristy and out the side entrance to my truck. Vale walked me out, which I found strange, and stood by the door of the truck while I loaded my equipment and said that she hoped the job had been manageable despite the complication, and that my invoice would be paid in full, and that she hoped I'd found Delham pleasant otherwise. I drove out of Delham on a Thursday afternoon in March. I've been back in my own town for 2 weeks now. The work I came home to has been ordinary, and I've done it well, which is the baseline I always work from and which continues to apply. I've spoken to my contact who referred the Delham job and told him the job was completed, payment received, no issues, which is accurate in the ways I'm prepared to describe. What I've been sitting with in the 2 weeks since is something I haven't been able to file into any category I have available. Not quite memory, not quite doubt. A quality of the last few days that is continuous with my ordinary experience in most ways, and different in one way that I can't locate precisely. The way a room feels different when something in it has been moved and you can't identify what. I know who I was before I drove to Delham. I know the work I do and the town I live in and the people I know and the life I've been living for the years I've been living it. All of that is present and accessible and feels like mine. What I can't fully account for is the Thursday afternoon, the drive out of Delham, the hours between leaving the church parking lot and arriving home, which should be 3.5 hours of highway, and which I remember as a continuous drive, but which I remember with a smoothness that doesn't match the way memory usually records 3.5 hours of anything, too even. The way light is too even when it comes from no identifiable source. I've been wearing my watch since I got home and checking it more than I usually do. I've been looking at my face in the mirror with slightly more attention than usual, checking for the thing I'd noticed in Delham's residence, the specific quality of adjustment, and finding either that I don't have it or that I'm not positioned well enough outside myself to see it. Vale said there was a well-practiced response to the situation of an outsider finding the door. She said it without menace, which means she said it with confidence, which means the response has worked before, more than once, enough times to be practiced. I don't know what the response is. I know what town I live in. I know who I am. I know my work and the people I know and the life that is unambiguously mine. I'm just not certain, checking the mirror each morning, whether that certainty is something I came home with or something I found waiting for me when I arrived.